All right, welcome to the world at 1500. So this is what we began the year here, and now we're kind of talking about this. I just wanted to remind you, it's all happening at the same time, and then we're going to discuss some of these empires. I just want to review some of the basics to just go along with the great presentations you guys gave, which I'm sure you all have shared in the Google Classroom. No disrespect, I'm going to skip over the empires of America. We learned about them last year in 9th grade, and unfortunately they are destroyed, right, by the Spanish. And so this year we talk more about their destruction rather than the awesomeness that were the Aztecs and the Incas. So let's dive into part one, what I like to call the Islamic empires. The first one is the Ottoman Empire, and I should have some dates here, but we'll say the height when they take Constantinople in 1453, but the Ottomans will last until 1919, or the end of World War I, so all the way into the 20th century, which gives you an indication of how powerful they are. So notice the map here, those of you who speak and read Arabic, I'm sure. Hopefully I'm not making this up. But this is the Ottoman Empire. How do you recognize it on a map? Hint, hint. It's located in what is today Turkey. That's the central part. But you can see it taking into the Arab world of North Africa here, and what is parts of Saudi Arabia, into parts of Iraq, but also Europe, southeastern Europe. They almost made it all the way to Vienna, Austria. So the basics of the Ottoman Empire, we saw in that video that started this unit that the Ottomans took Constantinople using these in 1453, and that was done by Mehmed II. But probably one of the great rulers of the Ottomans is Suleiman I. Like most of these empires, they had a strong military. They militarized gunpowder. Their soldiers were led by this elite guard of Janissaries who were actually Christian children that they scooped up somewhat voluntarily, sometimes not, and they were trained to be the elite guard. The government, like all great empires, was essentially a bureaucracy. So it was centrally located in Istanbul, but they had a great bureaucracy to help manage a diverse empire. The Ottomans were also very tolerant. So while, Islam, right, is the main religion and unifies the empire as a whole, they also allowed for people to follow their religious beliefs. And they lived in these communities, and the leader of, say, the Jewish community would then have a representative that they would send in to speak to the government. So it was led by a sultan, and then he had his wife and then his harem. And he also had an important counselor, the Grand Vizier, right, and various councils to help him govern. So most people believe Suleiman is the greatest. The Europeans called him magnificent, but the Ottomans called him the lawgiver, which speaks to what he did for the empire. He was a great patron of the arts. He was the sultan, the political leader, so that meant like emperor, but he's also the caliph, as I'm sure you remember from last year, meant the Ottomans saw themselves as like the inheritance of Muhammad's empire, that they were the leaders of Islam. And this portrait here, you can always recognize Ottoman rulers with the hat, was painted by Titian, a great Renaissance painter. So it shows some connections there. So Istanbul becomes, remember, Constantinople becomes a Muslim city. We can see this in the Hagia Sophia as it becomes a mosque. And in the architecture, we have the Grand Mosque, or the Suleiman Mosque. But the starred items, notice is our key theme for this video, are the goods that the Europeans wanted, right? Coffee, ceramics, and textiles, especially carpets. So the coffee, right, they'll take and plant in the Americas. Okay, so the great rival to the Ottomans is the Safavid in what is today Persia. So this dynasty will last until about 732. And it has the similar characteristics of the Ottomans, only they are Shia, right? And the Ottomans are Sunni Islam. I think you saw that in your presentations. And clearly this part's not important because I cut it off. So let's skip to the essentials. So maybe if you see this on a test, you can recognize Persia because it's in the middle. Here are the Ottomans over here and the Mughals. And so you can see kind of the border disputes. But Shah Abbas probably expanded the empire the highest and tried to maintain it. But because of his great rivalry with the Ottomans, he had Englishmen, right, our friend Robert Shirley, help train his soldiers. And they also engaged in trade with the Europeans. And because of their central location, they were definitely a crossroads, right, of trade. And so they were known for kind of culturally blending all of their influences together. This is a picture of Isfahan, which would become the capital for the Safavids, known for its blue mosques, right? How beautiful is that? And I chose these paintings to show the evidence of the cultural blending. So here's some traditional Islamic art. Maybe a little Ottoman influence, or they influenced the Ottomans. I chose this one because I thought it maybe reminded us a little bit of East Asia and maybe a little Europe here. So they were trading much with their tiles, with textiles, with the Europeans. Our last great Islamic empire are the Mughals. And so they're kind of in charge-ish until 1707. And then the British East India Company, which we've talked about before, and we'll talk about again, sort of starts to take control. And then officially, the British government takes control in 1857. More on that later. But essentially, so if you see it on a map, hopefully everybody can recognize the subcontinent here. And the Mughals controlled mostly northern India. This is an independent Hindu kingdom, but you can see the size changed over time. So the key thing is while it's in India, it is an Islamic empire. So they are Mongols, right? The Mughals are descendants from the Mongols, and they're a Muslim dynasty ruling over a Hindu majority people. And as you can imagine, that's not always great, right? Akbar is kind of touted as the great. Obviously, he was known for his tolerance, maintaining Hindu religious practices and the temples. Some think, was it the most sophisticated empire of its time? India has such an amazing cultural legacy that when people invaded, even if they were not from India, they sort of absorbed the civilization that was there. And so Akbar kind of kept that going of the arts, philosophy, culture, science. So what did the Europeans want? Spices and pepper, jewels, all kinds of things. And so India and China were kind of the big targets, right? These were the places Europeans were desperate to visit and trade with. Some building you should know, the SOL loves you to know this, and maybe you recognize it because it's one of the most famous buildings in the world. And this is the Taj Mahal, kind of the great example of Mughal architecture. In India is an Islamic tomb built for this man's wife. But she deserves it, right? I think she had like 14 kids. Okay, so let's move to a little further east, and we're going to start with China. So you can see the borders here. Within the white borders, that's China today. The Qing dynasty, which I want to introduce briefly here, but we'll come back to them later, controlled all of this part. So they controlled even more than what is today current China. So, whoops. Okay, so for now on the test, you'll be asked mostly about the Ming. However, you can see it's this time, 1644 is a big transitional year for the Chinese when the Qing took over and established this dynasty, which, as you'll notice, also like the Ottomans, will last until the 20th century. While we'll come back to them, the key thing for now is to know that the Qing were not ethnically Han Chinese. And so you can see it here in this picture from the Forbidden City. Here's the Chinese and here's the Manchu writing. For now, we'll just kind of focus on the Ming, which you might have touched on last year because it began in last year's time frame. But the two big things about the Ming is that they built the Forbidden City and they fortified the Great Wall. And the first Europeans had contact with the Ming, but then will also try to negotiate trade mostly with the Qing dynasty. So, things to remember about the Ming. Number one, the Great Wall. Notice these fortifications here, right? And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, that might be a little fuzzy, but that's an amazing picture. You're right. That's right. That's me. I'm on another part of the Great Wall, taking a picture of the Great Wall. Because, look at it, right? Is that cool? Speaking of my amazing photography skills, check out my overview of the Forbidden City with the authentic kind of smog in the background. So it was surrounded by this red wall, right? And inside you had a series of pagodas, and the emperor then was in the middle. And so only very few people would make it to the innermost sanctum of the emperor. So you can see kind of the complex, its vast complex of running the Chinese government. So here's some inside pictures. So you can thank this guy for making it not forbidden. And this is the emperor's throne room. So you kind of, if you were lucky enough to make it through all the way into the center. But this is, you kind of would see a series of pagodas and courtyards as you got closer and closer into the throne room. So Europeans will see this and be stunned and bring back tales of these magnificent palaces. And the European kings, as they become powerful in the next few centuries, will try to imitate this and build them on grand scales. Oops. So, China, of course, is the mother lode for Europeans. They're desperate to trade, but the Chinese are like, you guys are kind of inferior. I mean, maybe your guns are interesting and your clocks, but frankly, we don't need your stuff. So if you want to buy porcelain and tea, which is what the Europeans were desperate for, you had to pay in silver, right? You couldn't exchange European goods. So the Dutch and English are going to stay along with the Portuguese in Macau, and they're going to have to stay in these enclaves, right? Small settlements. And they had to follow and only engage in trade as per the Chinese government. But the Chinese, of course, as we know from last year, amazingly sophisticated technology, probably one of the first novels in world history written in China. Okay, so let's go. Might have messed with the editing. So sorry. I have amazing skills, I know. So we're talking about Japan, right? The Bakufu government, hopefully I already mentioned this, led by a shogun. But what I want you to remember about the Tokugawa and Japan up until 1868 is that they had a strict social hierarchy. So, if it's a military government led by a military leader, a shogun, then who's at the top but the warriors, right? Or the samurai. And so, this is a samurai when he was visiting Rome in 1615. And so I think some of the presentations mentioned the Ukiyo Prince and the Floating World. So they had amazing cosmopolitan urban culture, right? I think Edo in 1700s had like 1 million people. But what Japan had that Europeans wanted is silver. Remember, the Chinese would only take silver for their goods. And so the Europeans then were desperate to have access to the silver, which of course they would discover in the Americas, right, in Mexico and in Peru. So there you have it, the basics. Remember to use the Google Classroom to go back and catch some of the other details. and you can use your study guide for the test to kind of guide you in this.